Welcome to The Explainer. What if spirituality was just another addiction? It's a pretty provocative question, right? Well, today we're diving into an even more provocative answer from the spiritual thinker Gadadhar Das. He lays out this whole worldview that really challenges our modern ideas about love, society, and even progress itself. So let's dive in and unpack his arguments one slide at a time.
Okay, so let's jump right into the big question here. Is religion just another kind of drug? The speaker's answer is a very confident yes. But, and this is a huge but, he adds a twist that completely flips the whole idea of addiction on its head. See, he argues that unlike worldly addictions, which she says degrade you, what he calls a dharmic addiction is actually a form of purification. It's a positive obsession. He claims that while your typical habits bring a little temporary pleasure followed by a lot of pain, this spiritual kind of intoxication leads to ever-increasing joy. It even, and this is his phrase, makes you 100 times more efficient. So, to really get a handle on his perspective, we're going to walk through his logic step by step. We'll look at his idea of a positive addiction, get into his core concept of dharma, see how he contrasts divine love with modern love, and finally how he uses all of this to critique democracy and our very ideas of progress.
So, what on earth makes an obsession positive? Well, the speaker argues that these beneficial addictions are actually all around us, even if we don't call them that. He says you can see it in the intense drive of the world's highest achievers.
He brings up the example of someone studying obsessively for a major exam, or a top cricketer who is just relentlessly driven to score another century. He calls this junoon, or passion. Now, to an outsider, that level of dedication might look like total madness, but he argues it's the exact same focused energy that fuels spiritual devotion.
All right, so this is where it gets really interesting, because all of this connects back to one central concept: dharma. And for the speaker, this is way more than just religion or a bunch of rules you have to follow.
He actually defines dharma using this other term, gundharma, which means the intrinsic essential quality of a thing. You know, just like a chili pepper's nature is to be spicy, he argues that every single being has a fundamental nature. And that, he says, is its dharma. He then maps out this 4-step journey to liberation. It all starts with asakti, which is our natural attachment to things. You know, family, property, all that. Those attachments then create kartavya, or duties. Performing those duties is karma, or action. And finally, when those actions are aligned with a higher purpose, they become dharma. And that's the state that, in his view, sets you free. Okay, so from dharma, he moves on to maybe the most powerful human emotion of all, love. And right here, he draws this incredibly sharp line between the love we see in the world today and what he considers a divine ideal. And he really drives this point home with the story of Radha and Krishna. He recounts how Krishna supposedly explained that even marrying over 16,000 queens couldn't equal a tiny fraction of Radha's love. For the speaker, this is the absolute pinnacle of unconditional transcendent love. And this just brilliantly illustrates the contrast he's drawing. He describes Radha's love using the term parkiyapav, a state where love in separation is actually more intense than love when you're together. He sets this against modern love, which he pretty bluntly characterizes as conditional, checking someone's income first, and temporary, since it's bound by our short lives and often just ends in breakups. All right, so once he's laid out this whole philosophical framework, he turns his attention and his critique toward the very structure of modern society, and he starts with our system of government, democracy. He doesn't mince words here. He calls himself an intellectual opponent of democracy. In his view, the traditional Vedic system, a monarchy, was far superior. He sees democracy as a flawed system that's been forced on India, one that leads to, in his words, the widespread cheating of the common person. So, to back this up, he gives this pretty simple example. Imagine a village with 100 potential voters. Maybe only 70 are actually eligible, and out of those, perhaps only 50 people even show up to vote. In that election, a candidate can win with just 25 votes. And that right there is the core of his argument. That winning candidate, with only 25 votes, now gets to represent all 100 people. He concludes that this clearly means 75 people in that community either actively don't like him or just didn't participate in choosing him at all. So for the speaker, this isn't ruled by the people, it's ruled by a tiny minority. He basically calls it a bogus system and boils it down to 3 big reasons. First, he claims it's really run by business interests who bankroll the campaigns, not by the people.
Second, he argues politicians keep people divided by using caste to lock in votes. And third, they then cheat the voters by switching sides and changing alliances after the election is over.
And his critique of modern systems doesn't just stop with politics. Oh no, it goes even deeper, challenging our deeply held beliefs about social progress, especially when it comes to the changing role of women in society.
He throws out this really challenging question to question our modern narrative of progress. He points to high divorce rates, to conflict in homes, and he essentially asks, has abandoning traditional family structures for love marriages actually made anyone happier or more stable?
He contrasts this with what he describes as the Vedic culture. Now, according to his interpretation of the Manusmriti, girls were given in marriage by their fathers before puberty. The rationale, in his view, was that a younger woman could adapt more easily to her new family because she hadn't yet developed the ego that he claims comes later in life, and he believes this led to more harmonious families.
So what's the root cause of all this, according to him? He points to what he calls the one life theory. He argues that our modern education, which is based on Darwinism, basically teaches us that you only live once, and he believes this naturally leads to a culture of get yours now and indulgence, rather than long-term duty, completely severing our connection to the consequences of our actions in any future lives. And so we're left with this final, really provocative question that comes straight from his worldview. If you take away his concept of dharma, of this intrinsic nature and this sacred duty, what are you left with? From his perspective, is lasting happiness even possible? Or are we all just stuck in a cycle of temporary pleasure and inevitable pain? It's a challenging thought, for sure, and one that kind of asks us to look at the very foundations of our own modern lives.